I had exactly $842,118.16 sitting in an escrow account I was legally forbidden to release. And my brother wanted me to smile through a champagne reception while he lied about who owned the building tied to every decent memory I had of our father. He sent the text at 4:12 on a Thursday afternoon while I was standing in the doorway of my physical therapist's office, still stiff from the car accident that had left my shoulders strapped, my sleep broken, and my patience thinner than I like to admit. At first, the message read like logistics: black tie, arrive by 7, bring the blue file. Then came the real instruction. He said the buyers from Atlanta were attending, along with his fiance's family and half the Charleston preservation crowd. So for one evening, it would be easier if I let people assume I was outside counsel instead of his sister. He added that the family needed the sale to look simple. My mother called 3 minutes later in the careful voice she used when she wanted something ugly to sound reasonable. She said it would be best if I stayed off the stage during the announcement and avoided confusing people about ownership. Confusing people, that was her phrase, as if blood, grief, and a recorded deed could be reduced to a branding problem. What neither of them understood was that the person they were most desperate to impress had spent 6 months quietly looking into the title chain on our building for a reason my brother had no idea existed. So before I tell you what happened when the ice stopped clinking and a ballroom full of donors realized my brother had built his future on a forged transfer, let me take you back. My name is Lila Hart. I was 41 years old, and by then I had learned that the cruelest humiliation rarely arrive as insults. They arrive as edits. A seat moved, a name omitted, a truth reworded until it becomes convenient for everyone except the person living inside it. My younger brother, Graham, had been editing me my whole life. He was 3 years younger, louder, handsomer in the easy Southern way people forgive. Too much for, and raised with the kind of confidence that comes from watching a room rearrange itself every time you walk into it. Our mother adored Polish, and Graham was Polish-made flesh. He understood handshakes, donor dinners, golf club laughter, the exact distance between charm and entitlement. I understood paper. Not because I was colder than he was, but because paper never asked me to pretend. I became a real estate litigator because land remembers what people try to bury. Deeds, plats, assignments, lien releases, trust instruments, title commitments, affidavits. Every property tells the truth eventually if you know which drawer to open. By 36, I had built a good practice in Charleston, untangling ownership disputes for banks, families, and occasionally people wealthy enough to assume signatures were more important than consent. Then 9 months before the gala, a delivery van ran a red light on East Bay and folded the front of my car into itself. I was lucky, which is what people say when your injuries are survivable, but rearrange the pace of your life anyway. A torn rotator cuff, hairline rib fractures, weeks of physical therapy, a body that got tired too early, and a temper that arrived too fast when I pushed past it. My flaw, if I am honest, was older than the crash. I stayed composed too long. I gave people too many chances to correct themselves before I accepted that they were choosing not to. My father had owned the Marlowe building on King Street for 32 years. Red brick, a copper trim gone green in the corners, old pine floors that always held a faint trace of lemon oil and dust after closing time. The first floor had once been his bookstore, then a stationery shop, then a small design studio after retail changed and sentiment stopped paying rent. The upper 2 floors were offices. Nothing grand by Charleston standards, but valuable enough that every developer with a smile and a spreadsheet had tried to buy it at least once. To our father, it was never just an asset. It was proof that something steady could survive fashion, storms, and men with money explaining progress. When pancreatic cancer made plain what the rest of us were still trying to negotiate around, he redid his estate plan with a precision that surprised even me. The Marlowe building went into an irrevocable trust, not because he distrusted me, because he distrusted urgency. He named me trustee and Graham a beneficiary with a future distribution right if the building was ever sold, under conditions he set out in the trust. One of those conditions sat on page 17 under a heading in my father's neat, not unsentimental lawyer's typeface: fraud carve-out and canary clause. If any beneficiary concealed, misrepresented, or attempted to transfer trust property without the trustee's informed written consent, that beneficiary's share was automatically forfeited to the Heart Preservation Fund, a small charitable fund he'd created to help independent businesses on Lower King Street with facade and rent stabilization grants. When I asked him in hospice whether that language was excessive, he looked at me over the rim of his water glass and said, "No, it's accurate. If someone can profit from lying about ownership, they'll call it efficiency. Write the consequences while everyone is still polite." Graham acted wounded when he learned he would not control the building directly. He masked it under talk about flexibility and tax strategy. On him, but I heard the injury beneath it. He'd expected equal power, not equal eventual benefit. My mother agreed with him, though never cleanly. She called the trust rigid. She said families should not need clauses that sounded like warnings. She also said often that our father knew I was better with paperwork and Graham was better with people, as if that division were flattering to both of us. What it meant in practice was simple. I carried responsibility. Graham carried narrative. 2 months after the funeral, he brought me a proposal from a boutique development group in Atlanta interested in the Marlowe building. Boutique was the word he used when he wanted greed to sound tasteful. The offer was aggressive, full of glossy renderings and phrases like heritage-sensitive repositioning, which translated meant expensive paint, upscale leases, and the kind of renovation that preserves a facade while pricing out the life inside it. I told him no before he finished his second paragraph. The trust allowed a sale, but only if the charitable fund was fully endowed. The existing tenants were protected through relocation assistance or lease rollover, and the purchase agreement reflected a preservation easement. He said I was emotional. I said I was literate. That should have ended it. Instead, it began a quieter campaign. Small requests, drafts sent late on Fridays. A friend who wanted to talk tax consequences over drinks. My mother asking whether I really intended to keep the building forever just because grief made me sentimental. Then the accident happened, and for 6 weeks my world narrowed to ice packs, insurance forms, this and learning how to sleep without swearing every time I rolled over. During that stretch, Graham became helpful in a way that should have warned me sooner. He brought soup. He drove our mother to 2 of my follow-up appointments. He picked up mail from the office. One afternoon, when I was still on pain medication strong enough to make an hour disappear around the edges, he asked me to sign a packet allowing his banker to review historic operating statements so he could get a better refinancing quote in case we ever wanted flexibility. I remember the smell of lemon oil from the hallway table where he set the papers down. I remember the blue envelope under the stack because it had my father's handwriting on it, and I set it aside to open later. I remember signing one page and refusing 2 others because they referenced distributions I had not approved. Graham smiled, said no problem, and gathered everything with a patience I mistook for defeat. 3 weeks later, a woman from our tenant's insurance broker called my office to ask whether the building was changing hands. Her wording was careful, but not careful enough. She mentioned a preliminary title commitment. I asked for the order number. There was a pause long enough for embarrassment. Then she said she assumed I already had it. I did not. By 5 that afternoon, I had a copy. The commitment referenced a special warranty deed from the Heart Irrevocable Trust to Marlowe Revitalization, LLC, signed by me as trustee and notarized 8 days after my second concussion evaluation. I stared at the PDF until my vision blurred. And this is the part where people assume I exploded. I did not. I put the phone face down on my desk, then I waited. Anger makes bad timing. Paper rewards timing. The first person I called was Evelyn Price, the estate lawyer who had drafted my father's trust. Evelyn was 70, silver-haired, and so dry in conversation that younger attorneys often mistook her for half asleep right before she dismantled their entire argument. She had a voice that made panic feel adolescent. I sent her the deed and the title commitment. 12 minutes later, she called back and asked one question. Where were you at 11:14 a.m. on March 8th? I knew because that date had been the morning of my vestibular MRI. I said, in imaging at Roper Hospital, trying not to throw up in a machine. Evelyn was quiet for a second. Then she said, good. The acknowledgement on the deed says you appeared in person before a notary at 11:14 a.m. on March 8th. That deed is void on its face if we can prove impossible appearance. And if your brother recorded it knowing that, page 17 wakes up. That was how the legal part began. Not with a speech, with a timestamp. Evelyn explained the next steps the way she explained everything, as if facts were furniture and she was arranging them in a room large enough for no one to trip over. First, we would pull the recorded deed and all supporting documents from the Register of Deeds. Second, we would identify the notary, obtain her commission file, and compare signatures. Third, we would issue a preservation notice to the title company, which is a formal letter telling them litigation is likely and any closing without disclosure could expose them to claims. Fourth, we would prepare a lias pendens if needed. A lease pendens for anyone who has never had the pleasure is a public notice filed in the land records that there is pending litigation affecting title to a property. It does not win your case. It makes everyone else too nervous to pretend there is no case. Finally, if the evidence supported intentional fraud, we would petition the probate court to remove any beneficiary interfering with trust administration and enforce the canary clause. If you miss this, Evelyn said, you lose everything, not morally, practically. Once money moves and the building changes hands, recovery becomes slower, dirtier, and more expensive. There it was, the real clock. For 3 days, I lived inside records. The deed had been recorded by a closing assistant at Palmetto Harbor Title. The grantee was Marlowe Revitalization LLC. The LLC's operating agreement, obtained through a subpoena draft Evelyn prepared but did not yet issue, listed Graham as managing member and a second investor group out of Atlanta with a 35% stake. The deed amount was $1 and other valuable consideration, which is legal language often used in family or internal transfers, but in this case meant only one thing: concealment, while the real deal, paperwork, sat somewhere else. The notary was a woman named Candace Weller, whose seal was valid and whose signature looked just wrong enough to matter. Not obviously forged, worse, imitated. And the second thing we found was the purchase and sale agreement Graham had not shown me. My name was nowhere in it. He had signed as authorized trust representative. Attached was a seller's affidavit stating there were no undisclosed beneficiaries, no pending disputes, and no restrictions impairing transfer. I had never seen it. My father's canary clause might as well have begun humming in the walls. That would have been enough for a lawsuit. It was not yet enough for the kind of clean consequence I wanted. Because what Graham understood, even if he could not draft it, was image. He had planned the reveal before the challenge. And he intended to announce at the Charleston Heritage Partnership Gala that his family was contributing the Marlowe Building to a preservation-minded redevelopment effort anchored by his future father-in-law's donor circle. Once people applauded, once names attached themselves to a story of vision and legacy, he believed truth would look petty by comparison. His fiancée, Sloan Mercer, was not unintelligent. That mattered. She was the daughter of Daniel Mercer, chair of the Heritage Partnership Board and owner of Mercer Community Bank, the kind of regional bank whose name sat on theater plaques and hospital wings without ever becoming vulgar. Sloan ran the bank's philanthropic arm, wore restraint like tailoring, and had that polished composure wealthy daughters cultivate when they have spent a lifetime being watched. Because Graham had been with her 11 months, long enough to study the architecture of her world, not long enough, apparently, to understand that people raised around power often recognize counterfeits faster than ordinary people do. The text telling me to attend as outside counsel arrived the same afternoon Evelyn and I got the complete title chain, which meant Graham had no idea how much I already knew. My first instinct was to cancel the entire night with one email to the board and one draft complaint filed before close of business. That would have been efficient. It would also have been the wrong lesson. My flaw has always been patience, but occasionally patience ripens into strategy. Evelyn came to my office at 6 with a banker's box, 2 legal pads, and the blue envelope I had finally remembered to open. But it had been tucked beneath the packet on the day Graham asked me to sign. I had assumed it was one of the many condolence notes still surfacing after our father's death. It was not. On the front, in his handwriting, were 7 words. If Graham ever says simplify, open this. Inside was a short note and a key. The note read, Lila. There are copies in box 14 at Harbor Storage, not because I expect theft, Because I expect charm. Use only if needed. Love, Dad. Harbor storage had been his archive unit for old leases, invoices, and the paper debris of a man who believed every business mistake eventually turned into a lesson if you kept enough receipts. Box 14 held exactly what Evelyn needed most: a prior affidavit from my father to the trust drafter explaining why he insisted on the canary clause. In it, he described 2 earlier incidents I had not known in full. At 23, Graham had tried to pledge a future interest in the building to secure a personal line of credit, telling a lender he would control the property soon. At 28, he had pitched 2 investors on converting the upper floors into short-term rentals without disclosing tenant protections. Neither attempt had succeeded. Both established pattern. Evelyn smiled the way surgeons probably smile when imaging confirms what their hands already suspected. The second folder changed everything, she said. I slept 4 hours that night. The next morning, we met with a claims lawyer from Palmetto Harbor Title named Nora Bell. This was the ally twist Graham never saw coming because people like him rarely notice administrative competence until it grows teeth. Nora was not glamorous. Mid-50s, navy sheath dress, low voice, reading glasses on a chain. The sort of woman men in custom suits assume is there to take notes until she starts quoting their underwriter manual from memory. She reviewed the deed, the MRI timestamp, and the notary acknowledgement, then asked whether I could obtain hospital metadata showing my badge swipe into imaging and out again. I could. She nodded once and said, "Good, because security footage disappears. Metadata travels." That sentence mattered. Security footage tells a story people can argue about. Metadata tells a machine-tracked truth about when a file was created, altered, exported, or authenticated. By noon, Nora had located the PDF history on the deed package transmitted to title. The acknowledgement page had been created 21 minutes after the deed body and edited on a home version of Adobe registered to a user account ending in Graham's initials. Candace Weller's notary journal, once requested, showed no in-person appearance by me on March 8th. It did show an entry left blank between 2 legitimate signings. Sloppy greed is still greed. Nora did one better. Palmetto Harbor's office elevator lobby had a security camera. The video itself had already auto-deleted under a 30-day retention policy, but the access control logs remained. Graham's badge had scanned in that morning at 10:52. Candace Weller's at 10:54. Mine never did. That, Nora said, tapping the printout, is enough for me to deny insurability on the current title transfer. Without title insurance, the Atlanta group will not close. A Mercer Bank will not fund construction draws, and your brother's announcement becomes a very expensive fantasy. I asked whether she would put that in writing. She said, at the right moment. The right moment arrived 48 hours later, under crystal chandeliers and the smell of lemon oil polished into ballroom floors, old enough to remember better men. The Charleston Heritage Partnership Gala was held at the Wentworth House, one of those restored hotels where every staff member knows how to glide and every donor knows how to pretend they do not enjoy being seen. I wore a black silk gown because armor can be soft if it is cut correctly. My shoulders still ached when I fastened the clasp. I carried the blue file Graham had demanded, though not the version he expected. Evelyn rode with me downtown, not as my date, not as my shield, like as counsel. There is comfort in walking into a room with someone who has already priced the damage honestly. On the drive, she said only one thing that sounded like comfort. Do not save him from the accuracy of this. Then she handed me 3 envelopes. One for Daniel Mercer, one for the board's outside counsel, one for Graham, to be opened only if he forced a public lie. Inside each was a different combination of documents depending on how badly he chose to behave. That is the kind of preparation people call cold until they need it. The ballroom was all soft gold light, white orchids, and old money trying to look civic-minded. Ice clinked in glasses. Waiters moved in clean diagonals. The stage at the front held a rendering of the Marlowe Building, blown up on an easel beside a banner reading Legacy through Preservation. Legacy. They always choose words that sound clean before they do dirty things underneath them. Graham spotted me before I reached the cocktail tables. His smile came first, then the brief freeze behind it when he saw Evelyn at my side. He recovered fast. He always did. Lila, he said, kissing the air near my cheek. I'm glad you made it. You remember Evelyn Price, outside counsel on the title side. Outside counsel. He said it in front of 2 board members and a donor from Seabrook with a tan that looked permanent. I looked at him for 1 beat longer than politeness required and said, I remember Evelyn as the lawyer who drafted my father's trust. 1 board member blinked. Graham laughed like I had made a joke. My mother arrived a moment later in emerald silk, lips arranged in the strained version of warmth that appears when she wants a room to move past something inconvenient. She touched my forearm lightly, careful of the injury she had used in private to ask whether I was really up for all this legal strain. Then she told me there had been a seating adjustment. Apparently, the buyers wanted a more streamlined head table, but there was a lovely place for me near the side wall with some committee members and a donor couple from Kiowa. Streamlined, another edit. I said, of course. Her relief was instant and insulting. I took the side table because refusing too early would have wasted better theater. From there, I could see everything. Graham moving between clusters with his bourbon and his posture. Sloane in pale gold, speaking to an elderly preservationist with practiced sincerity. To Daniel Mercer by the stage, silver-haired and composed, greeting people without hurrying toward anyone. He had the look certain bankers and judges share, a face trained by years of listening while other people reveal themselves. Every few minutes his gaze swept the room, not warmly, not coldly, measuring. I understood immediately why Graham wanted his approval. Men like Daniel Mercer do not simply open doors. They decide who belongs in photographs once the doors are open. Dinner began with salads no one remembered and speeches everyone pretended to enjoy. I listened from my building. I did not have to wait long. After the Heritage Partnership chair thanked sponsors and the mayor made a brief remark about stewardship, Graham was invited to the stage alongside project stakeholders to speak about a landmark preservation initiative. My mother's hands came together first, too eagerly. Sloane smiled up at him with the expression of a woman about to applaud the life she thought she had chosen. Graham took the microphone with dangerous ease. He was good at seeming moved by his own lies. He spoke about our father, about Charleston, about continuity. Then he made the move we had planned for but hoped he might be smart enough to avoid. He said this project has been a family effort, and I'm grateful for the legal support that helped us simplify an otherwise complicated estate. Simplify. There it was, the word from the blue envelope. My father had known the shape of his son long before the rest of us admitted it. Then Graham gestured toward me, not by name at first, by function. Lila's been helpful on documentation. Helpful on documentation. As if I were an intern with a neat filing system, not the trustee of the property he was trying to sell out from under me. A few heads turned. My side table smiled politely in my direction and then back to the stage. I could feel Evelyn beside me become even stiller. Graham continued. He thanked Daniel Mercer for believing in the vision, thanked Sloane for standing beside him, and thanked Mercer Community Bank for its confidence in the financing structure. Financing structure, another useful phrase. It told Nora, who had arrived 10 minutes earlier and stood at the rear with board counsel, exactly which envelope needed to move first. I did not stand when he invited the wider project team to be recognized. I reached into my clutch and put the phone face down on the table. Then I waited. Daniel Mercer saved me the next step without realizing, which was part of what made the evening so clean. During the applause, he leaned toward the board chair, said something brief, and then rose from his seat instead of joining the standing ovation. He walked not to the stage, but to Nora Bell at the back. They spoke for less than 30 seconds. Nora handed him the envelope Evelyn had prepared. He opened it there under the ballroom sconces, while the room's attention remained loosely tethered to Graham and the rendering on stage. I watched Daniel Mercer read the first page, then the second. The change in his face was tiny and absolute. When he turned toward Graham, the applause began to die on its own. It is extraordinary how quickly a room can feel a power shift before it knows the details. Ice stopped clinking. Waiters halted near the sideboards, with trays balanced at the shoulder height. Graham saw Daniel moving toward the stage and mistook it for endorsement. He smiled wider. That was the last easy expression he wore all year. Daniel mounted the 2 carpeted steps and asked very softly for the microphone. Graham handed it over with the eagerness of a man expecting praise. Daniel did not look at him first, he looked at me. "Ms. Hart," he said, voice carrying without strain, "would you mind standing for a moment?" I did. Every head in the ballroom turned fully then. No more polite, partial attention. Full attention. Daniel held up the first page from the envelope. "Before this organization applauds a preservation initiative involving the Marlowe building, there is a question the board and this room deserve answered. Who, precisely, owns that property tonight?" You could feel the silence settle like dust after something breaks. Graham laughed softly into the microphone he no longer held and said there had been some confusion in the trust administration, but everything had been resolved. Daniel asked, "Resolved by whom?" "Calm is more violent than anger in certain rooms." Graham started to answer. Evelyn stood before he could finish and said, "By no one. I drafted the trust. Ms. Hart is the current trustee. Any transfer without her informed written consent is void under the trust instrument, and the recorded chain is under challenge for forgery." The word forgery landed exactly as hard as I had wanted it to. My mother half rose, then sat back down when no one looked at her. Sloane's face did something slow and terrible, not shock, recalculation. Graham tried the next lie. He said I had signed the deed weeks earlier and was only objecting now because I had become emotional about timing. Nora Bell stepped forward then, and I watched 3 men near the donor wall struggle to place her, because men often remember power by packaging. "Palmetto Harbor title," she said, giving Daniel a 1-page letter. "We have denied insurability on the purported trust to LLC transfer due to evidence of impossible appearance, notary irregularities, and document metadata inconsistent with an authentic signing." Then, because she was generous enough to explain in plain English for the civilians in the room, she added, "Without insurable title, there is no clean closing. Without clean closing, there is no bankable project." A banker in the second row exhaled audibly. That is the thing about financial terms. They sound abstract until somebody translates them into collapse money. Graham's face drained in layers. He said metadata proved nothing. Nora answered, "It proves the acknowledgement page was edited on a user account tied to your home Adobe license 21 minutes after the deed body was created. It also proves Ms. Hart's access badge never entered our building on the day your deed says she appeared before a notary. Her hospital records place her in MRI at the exact time of alleged signature acknowledgement. She spoke like a woman describing weather. That was worse for him than outrage." Sloane looked from Nora to me to Graham. "Is that true?" she asked him. He said the kind of thing liars say when cornered by machines and witnesses at once. "It looks worse than it is." Daniel closed his eyes for half a second, and not from fatigue but disappointment sharpened into decision. "No," he said, "it looks exactly like what it is." At that point, Graham did what entitled men do when systems stop bending. He reached for intimacy. He turned toward me and said my name, as if childhood could still be used as leverage. "Lila, come on, we can explain this. The investors are here, the board's here, don't do this now." I had waited my whole life for the moment I could answer him without heat. "You seem confused," I said. "I'm not the one who brought a forged deed to a fundraiser." Somewhere behind me, someone let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh choked off too late. The room loosened just enough for judgment to become social as well as legal. Daniel Mercer handed the microphone to the board's outside counsel, a lean man named Patrick Reeves, who had arrived late and opened his envelope in exactly the right mood. Patrick announced that in light of newly disclosed title defects and potential misrepresentation to the board, the Heritage Partnership was suspending any public association with the project pending independent review. He then used a phrase that was music to my particular line of work. "We have advised all parties to preserve documents immediately." Preserve documents means delete nothing, shred nothing, text no one you should not. It is a polite way to tell liars the walls have started recording. My mother finally stood. "This is absurd," she said, voice thin with panic. "Families have internal misunderstandings. This should not be happening in public." Evelyn did not even look at her when she replied, "This is not a misunderstanding. This is an attempted transfer of trust property using a false notarized signature. The public part was your son's choice." Sloane removed her engagement ring so quietly that only the people nearest the stage heard the small click when it touched the linen-draped cocktail table beside her, but everyone saw her hand bare itself. She did not cry. That made it cleaner. She said to Graham, "You told me the building issue was settled. You told me your sister wanted no public role. You told my father the trust was a formality." Graham reached for her wrist. Daniel stepped between them without touching either one. "No," he said, and Graham stopped. There are entire biographies in how quickly men stop when another man they respect uses the right tone. Then came the peace I had not expected but appreciated more with time. So Daniel turned back to the room and said, "For clarity, Ms. Hart was seated off stage tonight because several of us were led to believe she was merely advisory counsel. She is in fact the trustee and controlling legal authority over this asset. That omission was material. Material. In law and banking, a material omission is not a hurt feeling. It is a hidden fact important enough to change a decision. Half the board understood immediately. The other half understood because the first half went pale." Graham tried one last angle. He said the trust language was technical and no real harm had occurred because no closing funds had moved. Evelyn answered that too. "The absence of completed harm does not erase attempted fraud," she said. "And under the trust fraud carve-out, IT's attempted concealment alone can trigger forfeiture." Then she turned to me, just enough for the room to see the decision belonged where it always had. "Lila, there are moments when revenge tempts you into poetry. I have learned to mistrust those moments. I said only what mattered. As trustee, effective immediately, I am suspending all discussions concerning sale or transfer of the Marlowe building. Council will file for declaratory relief, record a lis pendens, and seek any further remedies necessary to protect trust property. This isn't revenge. This is justice." No one moved for a second after that. The ballroom went so still you could hear ice settling in glasses again, and one small brittle sound at a time. Then the room changed shape. Donors began turning away from Graham before he had technically finished being ruined. Lane board members gravitated toward council. 2 investors from Atlanta spoke in urgent whispers near the renderings, one of them already typing into his phone with the rigid speed of a man notifying partners that their weekend just got expensive. A photographer lowered her camera and did not raise it again. Graham came off the stage at last, not with authority, but with momentum he no longer controlled. He stopped 2 feet from me and said, too low for the room, but not too low for Evelyn, "You're blowing up all of this over a deed that never even closed." I looked at him and smelled lemon oil from the ballroom floor, and for one strange second I was back in my father's office, 14 years old, listening to Graham explain why he had borrowed my car without asking because he knew I'd be reasonable. Same face, same assumption. Airing different witnesses. "No," I said, "I'm blowing it up because you thought my consent was optional." He flinched like I had struck him. I had not even raised my voice. The official consequences started Monday. That part was less cinematic and much more satisfying. Evelyn filed a petition in probate court seeking confirmation that the deed was void ab initio, which is Latin for void from the beginning, not merely fixable later. She also moved to enforce the canary clause and requested instructions authorizing me to continue as sole trustee with power to pursue claims. We recorded a lis pendens against the Marlowe building before noon. Nora's underwriter circulated a denial of coverage on the current transfer. Mercer Community Bank froze all preliminary financing review tied to Marlowe Revitalization LLC. The Atlanta investors was suddenly sober about risk, sent Graham a notice of default under their operating agreement because he had warranted marketable title and authority he did not possess. For anyone who has never seen it, a fraud scheme often collapses not when morality arrives, but when cross-default provisions do. Graham had personally guaranteed 2 pre-development lines of credit to cover architectural fees, consultant retainers, and the performance life he had already begun living against a deal not yet closed. Once the title problem triggered investor default and the bank stepped back, those guarantees turned from abstract confidence into private exposure. He had expected ribbon-cutting photographs. He got demand letters. Candace Weller, the notary, hired her own lawyer by Wednesday. Her affidavit was a thing of brittle self-preservation. Yes, but it was useful. She admitted Graham had asked whether she could regularize a signature page he said had been signed earlier in private. She denied knowingly notarizing a forgery. She also admitted he had brought the acknowledgement page already partially prepared. It was enough for the probate judge to issue a temporary restraining order, preventing any attempted encumbrance or transfer of the building pending hearing. A restraining order in this context is not dramatic television. It is a court saying, "Stop touching this until I figure out which one of you thinks law is a costume." The hearing was 3 weeks later in Charleston County Probate Court. Fourth floor, fluorescent lights and gold benches, not nearly as grand as the ballroom where the lie had failed, but much more permanent. My shoulder ached from the old injury by the time we were cold. Graham arrived in a navy suit that had been cut for easier weeks. My mother came with him. She did not look at me. Daniel Mercer was there too, not because he had to be, but because his bank's financing team had been subpoenaed for limited records and because men like him understand the value of being seen on the right side of a clean line once it is drawn. Evelyn explained the canary clause to the judge with the patience of a woman describing a recipe she had already written out twice for people who refused to read. She pointed to the deed, the impossible timestamp, the hospital records, the access logs, the metadata trail, the notary affidavit, and my father's own affidavit from Box 14 establishing why he included the fraud carve-out. Yet Graham's lawyer tried every familiar argument. No damages because no closing. Ambiguity in trust language. Good faith misunderstanding among family fiduciaries. The judge stopped him halfway through the phrase, "good faith misunderstanding," and said, "Counsel, your client recorded a deed signed by a trustee who was in MRI at the stated time of acknowledgement. Be careful with adjectives." The courtroom went silent in exactly the satisfying way courtrooms do, when a judge has decided that dignity no longer requires pretending nonsense deserves equal air. 2 hours later, the order was entered from the bench. The deed was declared void. The attempted transfer constituted a material misrepresentation under the trust. Graham's beneficial distribution interest in the Marlowe building was forfeited to the Heart Preservation Fund under the Canary Clause. I remained sole trustee. The court authorized recovery of attorney's fees from any future distribution otherwise payable to Graham from the residue of the estate. The judge also referred the matter to the appropriate authorities for review of the false notarization and directed all parties to preserve documents. There was no dramatic gasp. Just a scratch of pens and the soft slide of paper as people accepted that one man's future had been reduced to the legal size it actually was. Outside the courtroom, my mother finally found language. It was the wrong language, which almost comforted me because by then I had stopped expecting transformation. She said, "He made a mistake. Why, you did not have to destroy him over it." I looked at her and understood, more clearly than ever, that what she called destruction was simply the end of insulation. "No," I said, "he destroyed the version of himself people could afford to believe in." Then I walked past her before she could convert pain into another appeal for my convenience. The financial collapse took longer, because spreadsheets do not scream. They simply remove options one line at a time. Graham lost the Atlanta investors first, then the consulting agreement he had bragged about to our mother, then the rental house south of Broad he had leased on the assumption that marriage, bank ties, and a development fee would begin paying for the life he preferred to stage early. Mercer Community Bank never sued him, which was probably a mercy, as they just declined to entertain anything with his name attached for a very long time. In Charleston, that kind of silence can cost more than litigation. Sloan sent me a handwritten note 2 months later, not to become friends, to do one honorable thing after her own embarrassment. She wrote that she had reviewed the board packet Graham had given her father and found my name omitted from every ownership summary. She enclosed a copy of an email Graham had sent 1 week before the gala, telling the Atlanta group that I was technically on paper but manageable. Manageable. I added the email to our file and sat with the note for a long time before placing it in the blue envelope with my father's letter. Truth belongs together when you find enough of it. As for the building, I kept it. Not out of stubbornness. I'm out of obedience to what it actually was. I refinanced properly, endowed the Heart Preservation Fund with the portion my father had intended for integrity rather than vanity, and worked with 2 long-term tenants on lease renewals that let them stay. We restored the copper cornice over 8 months, repaired the rear stairwell, and turned the old third floor corner office into a shared legal and accounting clinic for small businesses that could not afford full service counsel every time a landlord or lender decided to reinterpret fairness. The first time I walked the polished pine floors after the work was done, the place smelled of lemon oil and old paper and fresh paint. And for the first time since my father died, the building felt less like an inheritance and more like an answer. 1 year later, I stood in that third floor office by the tall front windows and watched late afternoon light catch on King Street traffic below while a new tenant signed her lease at the conference table behind me. The Heart Preservation Fund had already issued its second round of grants. 3 storefronts stayed open because of it. A bakery replaced a failing chain concept 2 blocks south. A bookseller I had loved as a girl reopened with help from money my brother would once have called wasted sentiment. My shoulders still ached before storms. My patience was still longer than most people deserved. But there was no waiting left in me for my family to become honest enough to deserve access to my peace. I saw my mother twice after the hearing. Once at a charity luncheon, where she pretended not to notice me until our eyes met and then discovered she no longer knew which version of me to address. Once outside St. Michael's after a memorial service for someone else, where she said she missed how simple things used to be. I told her simple was never the right word. Convenient was. We have not spoken much since. Silence, used correctly, is not punishment. It is architecture. I heard about Graham in fragments, which is how fallen men are usually discussed in cities built on reputation. Consulting in Atlanta that never lasted. A proposed partnership in Nashville that dissolved during diligence. A condo lease he could not keep. A smaller life, which would not have been tragedy if he had known how to live one honestly. And the cruelest thing that happened to him was not the forfeiture or the hearing or Sloane's ring clicking against linen under chandelier light. It was this. He lost the ability to convince a room that he was entitled to be centered in it. Once that illusion goes, charm becomes labor. Labor becomes fatigue. Fatigue tells the truth. If there is a lesson in what happened, it is not that family can betray you. Most adults learn some version of that earlier than they want to. It is that betrayal often survives for years, only because one person keeps agreeing to be manageable, keeps absorbing edits, keeps accepting smaller chairs, softened titles, delayed respect, private apologies that require public silence. The day you stop cooperating with your own reduction, people who benefited from it will call you cruel. Let them. Order is not cruelty. And boundaries are not revenge. And documents, unlike families, do not love you less when you make them tell the truth. So tell me this. If someone you love tried to make you smaller to finance the life they wanted, would you protect their image or would you let the record stand? And if this story stayed with you, follow along for more, because sometimes the quietest consequences leave the deepest mark.